One of the strengths of exegetical preaching is people will go through and they will pick out one Bible verse, and the Bible verse kind of crystallizes their point. And then they'll go to the next one and they'll pick out another Bible verse, and that Bible verse kind of crystallizes the point. But when that kind of preaching started, there was a kind of an unspoken assumption. And that assumption was is that the people already, for the most part, understood the stories and grand narratives of the Old Testament. We were in a very literate society, spiritually speaking. People pretty much had to go to church. So even if by accident you would have picked up a lot of it, maybe if not all of it. And so when they did that kind of stuff, they were jumping from proof text to proof text. And so in that kind of environment where you already knew a lot of the stories anyways, that made perfect sense. The proof texts were kind of shorthand for everything else that was going on. But today are pretty divorced from a lot of that. I even meet other supposed Bible thumper preachers, and they barely know any of the stories. What they know is their proof texts. So what they have is something out of its context. And without the context, you really can't understand what's happening. So here's a good example from the Gospels. There's an adulterous woman that is brought to Jesus. There's two factions of the Jews, and they basically say, what should we do? Should we stone her? And on the surface, you think the issue is adultery, but it's not adultery at all. None of that's going on is about adultery. Now, the law in the Old Testament was very clear. You couldn't just grab a woman or a guy that was committing adultery. You had to grab the couple. And if it was determined that they were committing adultery, then they could both be stoned together. But they didn't grab the guy. They grabbed the girl. And they took him there. So it's a strict violation of the law. There's actually a larger thing that you can't see in the scriptures that is part of the history. This is why you need to have the teachers of the church to reveal some of this historical stuff. During the Babylonian captivity, the Jews came up with the Babylonian Talmud, which was a series of debates between different rabbis on things. And they kind of changed a lot of things. They changed the way that they looked at a lot of things. But the actual law, as relayed by God to Moses, was that the couple was. So there was no he said, she said, or this guy did this, or someone else did something else. They had to be caught in the act. Otherwise, it wasn't going on. So what they were asking Jesus to do was to essentially vote to support their faction. To vote their faction, because how they dealt with this was the interpretation of how their faction was. So there's actually 2 or 3 stories all going at the same time. He does tell the woman, go and sin no more. But they were trying to get him to break the law with them. So that's all kind of part of the story. In the Old Testament, you have a lot of stories too. And those stories are like word pictures. They're very densely coded information. The best example of that is the creation story, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's like every 2 sentences is like could have a book with it. You know, it's very densely packed. The format of it is the format of a mythological story, because it was being given to people who had been raised on Egyptian mythology. So that was something that they would understand. And it's actually confronting all the lies that they had received up until that point with the truth that comes from God. So that's the format. So what is the format of a lot of the Old Testament, and specifically Genesis, Exodus, the Judges, Kings, that kinds of stuff? The format of it is a story. The fact it's thought that the story is even how our brain works, that maybe a lot of dreaming is in fact organizing all the random details of the day into a story. People used to say to me, well, brother, what's your story? You know, the story, what's my hero's journey? How did I come to Christ? Or how did Christ say, hey, here I am? But we've become divorced from those stories. So people are looking for little factoids to make their point or to try and arrange. But those facts, those individual verses, only really have their meaning within the paradigm of the story. So there's two types of stories. There's the little story where the story happens right then and there. Cain kills Abel. Then God marks him so people won't kill him. And then Abel is kind of a wanderer and he tries to create a city and he dies in the act of trying to make a city, but in essence alone. So that's the story of maybe Cain and Abel. There's actually a lot more details. The story's only a few paragraphs long. Other stories can span across the whole Bible. So I think one of the tribes that the Israelites were supposed to dispossess from Canaan land, God tells Moses, hey, Moses, I'm not giving you this land because you guys are so great. You're driving out the old tenants because they're really awful, and I'm getting rid of them. So one of those tribes actually tried to attack the Israelites out in the desert before they entered the Canaan land because they were afraid of them, and they figured, hey, that's where they're going to be the most vulnerable. They're not going to be able to come into the Canaan land and build fortifications or other kinds of stuff. Later on, one of those descendants ends up of the evil tribe. Some of them survived, and so one of their descendants ended up trying to genocide out the Jews once and for all. That's the story of Mordecai and all those people. And then supposedly one of their descendants ends up being one of the Herods who tries to kill Jesus. So that story spans the whole Old Testament all the way into the New Testament. The story of David is like a grand hero's journey. He starts off very pure, and he becomes essentially corrupted by power a little bit and by success, but he struggles for so long to get there. Then he has to deal with civil war with his sons and generals, people that were friends, people that had adventured with him. They betray him, and he goes through all this stuff. And if you don't understand these stories and how everything snaps together, you really don't have a very good knowledge of what's going on. You also don't have a very good knowledge of how God relates to you. So learning these stories is very important because they are like very densely encoded pictures, some of which you can immediately understand on the surface, and some things you have to really gnaw on for a long time. Or maybe you can understand them, but you can't articulate them. They're true, but they're hard to articulate. So the stories give you the paradigm. They organize, they're organizations of the information. The stories give you something to kind of think about. So for instance, did you know that Jacob and Israel are the same person? A lot of people don't know that. You read the Psalms, it'll say like Jacob, like Israel. Well, there's a story there. There's something that's going on there. And you better find out what it is because God wants you to know it. That's why it's at the front of the book. In case you get bored halfway through, at least you got that part. You got to learn the stories. It's time for us to go back to learning the stories again. Now, to help you out a little bit, I have a lectionary that I will post a link to. And that it's an organized reading plan. It's read every Sunday and the other holy days of the week throughout the year. Ours is called the Modern Syrian Lectionary, and it covers almost the entire Bible in 1 year. So if you read it 3 years in a row, you will have read almost all the Bible 3 times. But it's supposed to be something that you gnaw on. It's supposed to be something that you think about. You're supposed to think about the stories. You're supposed to think about the people in them. The people in the Old Testament are not ultra pure. They make no bones about how not ultra pure they are. And you learn from that. You see them overcome their problems. You see them wrestle with their own personal inadequacies and come to grips with themselves and with God. So I encourage you to get in and read the stories, learn about them, think about them, and so that when you hear somebody quote part of something, you can get the rest. Because the rest is really what you also needed to know, not just a proof text because you were lazy and didn't want to have to learn it. So, what you don't want to learn is basically what is going to help your mind grow so that you can be happy and fulfilled. And by not learning it, you rob yourself and you rob God from the benefit of that. That's all.